And hello, Jets fans, and welcome. The offseason has officially begun, and Rich Sports Talk will be your host for this offseason. We have a ton to get to this offseason. We have a lot of storylines about the New York Jets. And one nice thing this offseason, though, will be variety because it won't just be about Aaron Rodgers' watch. There is a lot to talk about. I'm going to go in depth, and I'm also going to implore you to check out the community part of our page. I currently have a poll right now about what you think the Jets should do with Bryce Huff. I will get to that poll result throughout this show. But I also want to put some more things out there. There's some ideas I have for shows, how I'm going to approach this, and how we're going to do this offseason. So I want to hear from you guys what you guys would like to see. So make sure you give us a like, give us a subscribe, and check out the community page and that poll. We will make sure to update that throughout the offseason. Little note, so I know we're starting to get into mock draft season. Here's my thing. I like to do a full 7-round mock draft. I do that after free agency, but before free agency, I will do a 3-rounder. I will get to that in the coming weeks. Again, I usually like to do it after the Senior Bowl. I still think it's a little too early in the process. You still have some players deciding if they're going to the NFL or staying in college. So there's a lot to get into there, but we will get to that shortly. But the Jets have a big dilemma already, and it's not the quarterback position. It's what to do with Bryce Huff, because the Jets in our history have struggled to find that great pass rusher and really haven't had a double-digit sack artist and a great edge rusher since John Abraham. I'm not kidding. So when the Jets found Bryce Huff, and I remember on this channel saying that he was a dime in the rough because I had a 3rd-round grade on him. And I said, look, this is a great job by Joe Douglas. And I do include him in that draft. I know the 2020 draft wasn't great, but I still include him because the Jets found him. They've developed him. And this year, 10.5 sacks, double-digit sacks. And there's a lot to get into. But the first thing I want to say is, for fans to get on Huff's comments on the post game saying he's not going to take a hometown discount and that he wants to get as much money for his family, I have absolutely no problem with that. This is also a player we have to remember. This wasn't a 1st-round pick. This was an undrafted free agent. He made $2 million this year. $2 million for 10.5 sacks. And you cannot tell me he's not seeing the free agent market for pass rushers and going, I'm going to have an opportunity. At the age 25, he might have 2 bites at the apple. If he signs a 3 or 4-year contract and comes out at the age 29 and 30, he's probably going to get another big contract. So I do not give him any grief. I know the Jets also, a lot of fans blaming the front office for not locking up long term. The hard part was he was a situational pass rusher for this team. He continued to develop. This year took a really massive step forward. And I do think the Jets were preparing for this eventuality with Will McDonald, that draft pick. So the Jets are in a tough spot because it's clear Huff wants to get paid. He deserves to get paid. And I do know as a fan base, it would be frustrating to see a 25-year-old pass rusher that this team has developed let walk out the door. And especially when you're assuming this team's going to have more leads next year with Aaron Rodgers and hopefully better quarterback play. The way I look at the Bryce Huff situation is the following for this Jet team. And I know there's going to be some unpopular opinions. If you're joining us in the live stream, you can give us their comments. If you're joining us after, you can put it in the comments as well. We'd love to hear your opinions. Here is my honest opinion about the Bryce Huff situation. The Jets need one of 2 things to happen. They need to either bring him back or they cannot let him walk out the door for nothing. And that to me is the most important. And I will get to that option in a little bit. But let's keep the easy option. Let's say keep him in-house. Now, the Jets can't put the franchise tag on him. It hasn't been determined, but it's clear it's probably going to be in the mid-20 million range. Now, on the surface, that doesn't seem like a bad thing. Jets get to keep control of him. But the problem with the franchise tag is it is dead money until you renegotiate a contract. So it counts against the cap, and the Jets have to have that cap space in order to tag it. And the Jets right now don't have that. Now they could negotiate some contracts, cut some dead weight, but either way, that's going to be a major cap hit. And there's a couple of problems I see the Jets having with having him play on the franchise tag next year. Number one, this defense is not the problem for this team. Even if they lose a great player like Bryce Huff and this defense takes a slight step back, I still think this is going to be a top 5, top 6 unit. But the problem is the Jets' offense is horrendous. And it's clear it's going to need significant investment in both the draft and free agency. And if the Jets, let's play devil's advocate, want to sign 2 offensive linemen in free agency, and you want good offensive linemen, it's likelihood going to cost you combined 25, 26 million, about 12 to 14 million a year if you're lucky for a tackle and a guard. So that is $28 million that the Jets are likely going to mean. That's just for the offensive line. That doesn't include receivers. That doesn't include bringing back other key pieces on this team. And the other thing, too, is you have to wonder if you do keep Huff, somebody on this defense is going to have to go. There's no way the Jets are going to keep everyone. Now, I think Rich Cimini's take about trading one of these great young corners makes absolutely no sense because you're paying DJ Reed and Michael Carter nothing for what they're actually performing. CJ Mosley, I think they're going to bring back. I do think that the way his contract is structured, it doesn't help them with financial stability to just cut him. I think it's going to be a renegotiation. The one guy I could see being released is John Franklin Myers. Although if I was the Jets, I would try to trade him because I still think there would be a team that would give you a mid-round, maybe even an early day 3 pick for him. The problem is John Franklin Myers and Bryce Huff is going to be a major talking point with this team. Because on the one hand, John Franklin Myers, the good things about him is his floor and he brings versatility. He can play defensive end. He can play defensive tackle. He can move all along this line, and he fills multiple needs on this defense. And at the bare minimum, he is a very good player. He's not going to blow up the stat sheet. He's not going to have a ton of sacks, but he's a really good mixed player on this team that can play multiple positions and fills multiple roles. Huff, on the other hand, doesn't have that floor. I mean, he has this great year this year. We know he can get to the quarterback, but the question is, can he get even better? Or is this the best we're going to see him? Because if this is the best we're going to see him, it does kind of not make sense for the Jets to bring him back when you already have 2 edge rushers you've invested first-round picks in. You've already invested a ton of money in Quinnen Williams. And John Franklin and Bryce Huff can't play multiple positions. Huff has to play on the outside edge. So there's a lot of issues bringing Huff back. It's not just simply sign him and play, because I do think if you bring Huff back, you're going to have to significantly rework this roster and let go of a good piece like John Franklin Myers. And I know a lot of people are saying, well, get rid of John Franklin Myers. I get it. There's more upside with Huff. But then this interior defensive line, which is a weakness, now you're going to have to find another piece for this team. So the biggest problem with the franchise tag too is, once again, that inflexibility. The Jets need offense. And right now, if the Jets have to let a pass rusher go to get an offensive player, I'm okay with that because, again, this offense is horrendous. It needs help. Like, they cannot function again like this. And I was thinking about what are some of the possibilities you can do with Huff. Obviously, you can put him on the tag and have him play this year or work to get a negotiated contract for next year. You can sign him to a long-term deal. But the problem is, I don't think that Huff is going to just stay here. I think if you're going to get a long-term deal done, it's going to be through his tag and a renegotiation, because he's going to test the free agent market. Because free agency in the NFL, we have seen time and time again, B-plus players get A-plus money. And even if you think Huff is an A player, an A-minus player, he's going to get paid. There is going to be a team that has a ton of cap space that looks in and goes, yeah, we can pay him. The Chicago Bears are a great example. They have loads of cap space. You don't think that they would pay $25 million when they're not paying a quarterback? If they draft Caleb Williams, they're not paying a quarterback for 4 years. They already have Montez Sweat on that team. You don't think it entices a team that loves their defense to get another bookend edge rusher next to Sweat? There's a lot of teams with cap space that would love Huff. And it's not just as a defensive end. There might be teams that look at him as a great stand-up 3-4 outside rusher. Maybe guys see him as an every down player. All it takes is one team. It just takes one team with a big paycheck that could look at Huff, and there's going to be at least one team, I can almost guarantee you, that will look at it and go, okay, he's an every down player. Maybe the Jets don't view him as an every down player, but there will be a team that will view, I really believe, Huff as a 15 sack player and a player that is ascending and a player that's going to get a lot of money. Now, a lot of people comparing it to the Carl Lawson contract where he got $15 million a year, but Huff at least got double-digit sacks on a team that didn't have a lot of leads, on a team where he was a rotational player. And I do think that's going to be a major part of it. So now what do the Jets do? We already went through one option. You tag him so you can either keep him or tag him for a renegotiation and get a long-term deal, which I think is a smart play. The Jets, though, have a problem. If they tag him, it's going to take up a major portion of the cap. The Jets, however, cannot afford to let him walk out the door for nothing. Yes, I know if he does sign in free agency, they had a compensation pick. Whoop-de-doo. That really helps this team that is going for broke this year and a front office and a coaching staff that knows that they don't make the playoffs, they are getting fired. That's really going to help that team. So I was thinking, what could be the market for Bryce Huff? I think we saw it at the trade deadline this year. You saw Montez Sweat go for a second rounder and a fifth rounder. Leonard Williams, again, defensive end, more of a 3-4 inside defensive end, but you saw another guy that went for a 2 and a 5. If the Jets can turn Huff into a second round pick and a fifth, or even a second and a sixth, and they can replenish that second round pick and turn what was essentially an undrafted player into a second round pick, I do think that that could work. Now, I know a lot of people are already banging the keyboards and entering the comment section saying, well, we don't trust Joe Douglas to make those picks. What are they going to take in the second round? And I really thought about this for the second round pick because the Jets have two needs on this team that outweigh a pass rusher. Now, for a little about me, there are certain positions I value in the NFL more than maybe other people do. For me, the most valuable position on defense right now is a pass rusher. I do think that it is rare to find a great pass rusher, and when you do everything to keep them. However, there are two positions and position groups, let me just paint them with a broader stroke, that I do think are a lot more important for long-term success of a franchise. Number one is obvious. It's a quarterback. You don't have a quarterback, you can't win in this league. And the number two thing is offensive line. And because offensive line is so poor in the NFL right now, I almost just broad stroke it as any of the five positions. If you can get a good offensive lineman, I don't care if it's a guard, I don't care if it's a center, I don't care if it's a tackle. If they are a good offensive lineman, they are incredibly valuable and incredibly hard to find. What does this draft have a lot of, which will be there in the second round? This is a very deep offensive line class. This is also a very deep quarterback class. So if the Jets can position themselves in the second round and get that pick back that they traded for Aaron Rodgers, essentially, it allows them to have a lot more flexibility in this draft to get one of those two positions. And if they are able to then turn that pick into one of those two, I think is an incredibly valuable. Like if you look at the draft order right now, a couple teams that I would keep an eye on that make a lot of sense, potentially. What about Arizona at 35? Arizona could use a pass rusher. They're in a division where they could use a pass rusher. And I do think they have some cap space. That could be a team I would see in the market for a potential one. The Los Angeles Chargers are another team. Again, I don't want to trade Huff to the AFC, but the Chargers, you look, Khalil Mack getting older, Bosa getting up in age. That could be an interesting spot. The Titans at 38. I know a lot of people would hate this idea, especially in the market, but the Giants have 2 second-round picks, including 39. The Commanders have the 40th pick. They also have the 36th pick. So they have 2 high-end second-round picks just sitting right there that I could see doing that. Once again, the Giants also have 2 second-round picks. And the reason I bring up those two teams are those are teams that could use a pass rush. And look, I know the Giants are playing a 3-4. Maybe they can convert Huff to an outside linebacker. And I know Jets fans would hate it, especially if Huff becomes a star. But here's the thing. let's play the devil's advocate. The Jets get one of these 30th or 40th picks. What's to say if a quarterback is sitting there at pick 30 or 31? Now the Jets are in range where if there's a franchise quarterback they like to sit behind Rodgers, they can go and get him. That way they can keep a fifth-year option. Maybe there's a guy that they really like in the second round. Every year there's a guy that falls. Will Levis was an example last year. I didn't think he fell to round 2, but he did. But the other thing too is even if it's not a quarterback, this team needs offensive line. I think it is abundantly clear. And I'm going to do a whole episode on creative ways they can address the offensive line. We've already heard from Sal about how they're going to stick AVT at one position, how they can address free agency, how they can address the draft. But in the draft, you can get a high-quality starting offensive lineman in the second round. It might not be a tackle, but you can get a good interior one. And my thought process is, can you get one to put next to Tippmann maybe? You look at AVT. If he goes to tackle, maybe you could draft a starting caliber guard in this range in round 2. And if the Jets find another offensive lineman, I'm not saying a Pro Bowler, but a good offensive lineman that is on this line and is a starter for 8 to 10 years, to me, that is more valuable than Huff. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, you need a great pass rush. Well, the Jets have Jermaine Johnson. They have Quinnen Williams. They have Will McDonald, and Will McDonald's going to be a huge X factor next year. Because if he is 3/4 of the player Bryce Huff is, I think the Jets will be fine. But he needs to be, and look, I think he's shown the ability to get off that edge. He's a great athlete. There's a lot of upside with him. And the one thing I will say about this coaching staff, and they have their warts, I trust them to develop the defensive side of the ball. Offensive players, I don't necessarily trust. But the defensive players, if they were to take a pass rusher in the middle rounds of this draft, I would have high hopes that they could develop it because they've developed guys like Ashton Davis, who we thought was a bust, into what looks like a starting caliber safety. We've seen them develop Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed, Michael Carter, Quincy Williams. I mean, they took Quincy Williams from the scrap heap and have turned him into an all-pro. They have taken Jermaine Johnson, who a lot of people thought was a big swing by the Jets in the draft last year, and he looks like one of the top ascending defensive ends in the entire NFL. So if there's a part of one thing I could trust with this coaching staff, it's to develop the defensive players. Offensively, I'm not sure, but my thought is they have to turn into something. And who knows what quarterbacks could be there? Could Bo Nix fall into round 2? Could he be someone that the Jets see as someone that could sit behind Rodgers for a year or two and learn? I think you have to take the Green Bay model where Jordan Love, like everyone's swooning over Jordan Love. And the one narrative I hate this week is, oh, the Packers did everything right. No one's giving Aaron Rodgers any credit for, being the quarterback and instilling knowledge and allowing Jordan Love to develop for 3 years. I mean, as much as everyone loves Jordan Love and Patrick Mahomes, they got to sit. And I think the Jets have to learn that throwing Sam Darnold to the Wolves, throwing Geno Smith to the Wolves, throwing Zach Wilson to the Wolves wasn't going to work. It hasn't worked here. They need to develop someone. And if you look at this draft right now, I could see a quarterback land. That's why this round 2 pick, if you can turn Huff into a 2 and a 5 or a 2 and a 6, I think that is incredibly important for developing this team. Now, the other thing too is let's also put this out there. Let's say the Jets also get an extra 5th round pick. Let's say they do get Huff for a 2 and a 5. Well, that 5th round pick could be valuable. Maybe they trade for a veteran receiver to add to Rodgers, but maybe it could also be used in a package to move up in the draft. We talk about these 2 great tackles. Maybe the Jets have to bump up a couple of spots. And if you've got that 2nd round pick in the bag, if you have that 2nd round pick in your cachet of draft picks, maybe Joe Douglas in this front office feels more comfortable saying, all right, we'll trade our 1st rounder and our 3rd rounder to move up 2 or 3 spots to get the tackle. Because it's a lot harder to move up in the draft, and you're a little bit more wary when you will not have a pick on day 2. If the Jets have that day 2 pick and they move up, then they have another couple possibilities. Okay, they played the game, they moved up to get the offensive tackle. Great. Maybe in the second round, a receiver has fallen that they could select, or maybe there's a player that another team has to have. Another team is dying to get up to the number 2 pick. Like maybe the Jets had the 40th pick. There's a team that's desperate to come up and get a player, to leapfrog, to jump a team that they know is going to take it, like what the Jets did with Bryce Hall a couple of years ago, because the Jets knew the Bills wanted Hall. So that's why they went up and got Bryce Hall. Could there be a team like that? And it gives the Jets basically the capital back. They move back a couple spots where they get a 3rd round pick maybe back. Maybe they get a 4th round pick. The more picks they have to play with, the better in order for moving around in the draft, maybe going up to get key pieces that you need, but also having pieces to go and trade for veterans. I mean, they got Chuck Clark last year for a 7th round pick. Maybe there's a veteran safety that they could target under the radar. Maybe there's a receiver that they could trade a day 3 pick for to add to the receiver rotation. Maybe there's a defensive player that they like, that they feel has upside. Like maybe there's another Quincy Williams where they look at a player and go, we think we can take him from being a C player to a B+ player because he fits our scheme better. Having those draft picks is incredibly valuable. But this goes back to the main point I've been emphasizing with Bryce Huff. You cannot let him leave for nothing. He either has to be a member of the 2024 Jets or he has to be an instrumental piece in getting more pieces for the 2024 Jets. If the Jets just let him walk for a compensation pick that this organization, this current construction might not be able to use because they might be gone next year, that would be an incredible waste. And sometimes in the NFL, it sucks. You don't want to lose these great young pieces. But the smart teams use it to their advantage. They trade them early. They trade them for draft picks. They understand the market. And one thing about Joe Douglas, you can kill him for how he built this roster this year. You can kill him about how he didn't get the backup quarterback. But one of the few areas where every Jet fan can feel positive is you feel like with a trade, he's going to get good value. And if he has Bryce Huff on the trade block, he probably will get the max value he can. And who knows? Maybe there's a team out there who looks at Huff as a 1st round pick and the Jets get a late 1st round. I'm not saying an early, but maybe there's a team like Houston who says we desperately want a pass rusher. Maybe it's a team like the Cardinals, who again have an extra pick from Houston, who say we could use the 27th pick. Maybe it's a team like Kansas City at 28 currently. Maybe it's a team like the Lions. I think the Lions could be a very interesting trade partner for the Jets. Number 1, you get Huff out of the AFC. Number 2, they're a team that really doesn't have a lot of holes. And you look at their team, especially next year, it's still very young, have a lot of draft capital. They're a team that probably doesn't need much, but if you could dangle Huff out there, maybe you can convince the Lions to get their 1st round pick, maybe even a 6th round pick as part of the deal. Or maybe you don't get that 1st round pick, but the Lions have such good offensive line depth. Maybe there's a young offensive lineman that you like on their team as a backup that you want to bring in to compete next year. Maybe there's a receiver that the Lions feel they're not going to be able to sign long-term that the Jets could target. There's a lot of good pieces on that Detroit team where I could see the Jets, and especially a 1st round pick. I'm looking for teams that would make sense. The Lions, who are in a win now window, you have Dan Campbell, a guy that loves his defense and his pass rush. You don't think Aiden Hutchinson would love having Bryce Huff as a running mate? You don't think the Lions would love to have that dynamic duo coming after quarterbacks in the NFC? And look, the biggest worry I would have is facing Huff in the AFC. You get him out of the AFC, you get him to the NFC, you get him to a team that has decent cap space, you give him to a team that you can get a 1st round pick for. And at 30, that's where, if they, let's say, even if they don't get to 30, they're the late 20s, gives Jets flexibility. Maybe there's a top 15 player that falls down. Maybe there's a player in the top 10 that falls in the 15. The Jets trade up to get him. It gives the Jets options. The one thing that doesn't give the Jets options is if they just let Huff walk. All right, guys, let's get to some of your comments. If you have a comment, please put it in the chat window. If you're joining us after the video, of course, put it in the comments. We'll get to them eventually. And I know where Drones is re-sign Huff, man. Let's check out the poll right now. I'm guessing Drones put it in there as well. I gave 3 options. Currently in first place, we have the option of sign a long-term deal, but lose free agency flexibility. Tag and see what happens is in second, and tag and trade. No one wants the tag and trade option, because the problem too is, like, I have to give a scenario, because it's not just, oh, you sign him. The problem you have is, like, you sign him, but then does it cost you a receiver to help this offense? Does it cost you an offensive lineman to help this woeful offensive line? And the other thing too is, like, if you re-sign Huff, then I think you have to look to cut JFM or try to trade JFM. And I don't think he has the same value as Huff, but the Jets need to move a couple pieces. I know Rich Samee teased a couple surprise cuts on this team. I don't think it's going to be one of the mainstays of the defense, but I mean, I think John Franklin Myers is maybe the one, because, again, he has a high cap hit. And again, he's a really good role player. But the problem is, when you're trying to pay guys, the role players sometimes fall by the wayside, and it turns into can we find a cheaper guy in the draft? Can we find a cheaper guy in free agency? Maybe they're 80% of what he brings to the table, but if it's at half the salary, it makes more sense for us. So Drones, of course, saying re-sign Huff. And look, this is my opinion too. Like, and I don't want people to get this misconstrued, because I think this happens a lot in this medium, is when I bring up the idea of trading and tag and train, that's not my first option. I still think the best thing for the Jets is to keep Huff, because he's a good player. He's an ascending player. And the other thing with Huff too is he's a homegrown player that you've turned from a undrafted player into a great pass rusher. The problem is, this is the NFL. The NFL, there is a cap. The NFL, you have to look at every single option on the table, and you have to consider what is at place here. So the other thing you have to look at too is how the Jets have built this team. And I know a lot of Jet fans don't want to hear this, and I get why. But this team is invested in a first-round pick in Jermaine Johnson. They clearly have hit on that. They've invested in Will McDonald. And I do think in the brief time we've seen McDonald, we have seen the flashes, and you see why the Jets wanted to draft him. He's a little bit quicker and twitchier than Jermaine Johnson. Jermaine Johnson's more of that power rush defensive end, where you get McDonald, who's more of a speed guy. And you look at it and go, if they lose Huff, but let's say they get 8 sacks from McDonald next year, or 9 sacks, you wonder if it's that much of a loss. And the thing too is, the Jets have shown on this defense that they can find guys later in the draft, or undrafted, or cast-offs, and turn them into pretty decent players. And I'm wondering if that's their mindset. The problem too is, again, if you bring back Huff, if it costs you an offensive lineman, is it worth it? Because this offense with that offensive line can't function. If they don't have an offensive line to protect Aaron, this team's not going to function next year. And as much as I love this defense, as much as I love Huff, you have to look at the whole big picture. And if Bryce Huff's going to cost you a key piece on that offense, it's almost not worth keeping him. And I get the notion. I get where Drones is coming from. And again, I want to hear from you guys. Check out on the community page. Check out our poll. Let us know in the comments what you think about Huff, what your options, what scenarios you could imagine. Because, look, I do think there's going to be a market for Huff. JFM, I don't think there'd be as much. I think at the best, maybe a 4th-round pick, because, again, he's a good player, but more of a rotational player, and someone that's going to have a high cap hit as well. James Paulini, Rich, this is an offensive league. We need to stop paying high dollars on defensive player and put more money on the O-line, wide receiver, and backup QB. And James, I think you hit it right on the head. If you tag Huff, you either get him quickly on a long-term deal that's feasible, or you trade him. Because in a perfect world, if everything works perfectly for the Jets, right now, if they renegotiate a couple of contracts, they cut the obvious pieces, they'd have about $45 to $50 million. I know what a lot of fans are thinking. Wow, that's a good amount of change. Here's the problem, though. If we start just going quickly down the list, you want to get a good offensive guard in free agency, probably going to cost you 12 to 15 million a year, maybe more. But let's say 15 million. Let's say that you want to bring in the great tackle from Dallas. That's probably going to be a high 1-year deal. That's probably going to be 17 or 18 million. You want to bring in Jacoby Brissett, that's probably 9 to 10 million. Just on those three players, you look 10 million for the backup quarterback, 15 for a guard, that's 25. And if you sign another tackle, minimum 16 probably, but just for the sake of the math, we'll do 15. So about $30 million on offensive line, 10 on wait a minute, there's only $10 million left. And that's before you got on a receiver. That's before you've re-signed Greg Zerloin. It's before you've re-signed Morstead. It's before you've re-signed Ashton Davis. It's before you've re-signed a couple of these fringe roster guys. So if you tag Huff at $25 million and it costs you while you're negotiating a potential guard or a potential starting offensive guard or offensive tackle, it's incredibly difficult and frustrating because there are more important pieces on this team. Tony Alexio, another great JD Moon, not signing Huff early for a cheaper rate. Look, Tony, like I get where there's going to be a lot of frustration with that. I get where a lot of Jet fans are going to come from, but I do think this team kind of prefaced that with the McDonald pick. Again, I know it's not what Jet fans want, but the thing too is with Huff, you also have to wonder, did Huff want to re-sign a deal? From all indications, it doesn't seem like the Jets were hyper aggressive in getting an extension done. But the other thing you have to wonder with Huff too is coming into the season, we have to remember, yes, he had all the great pressure rates, and yes, he was good at getting to the quarterback. But Huff coming into this season through 3 years, had 7.5 total sacks for 3 seasons. I feel like the same people that are killing Joe Douglas for not giving extension, if Joe Douglas gave him a $10 to $12 million a year extension, would be going, what are you thinking paying a guy that hasn't even had a 5-sack season yet, who's a role player? So I do think that this was Huff's breakout season. And you also have to wonder, it's a two-way street. Huff probably looked at this again. It was a contract year. He balled out in a contract year. So you also have to wonder, too, I'm not saying Huff's going to regress, but this was huge for Bryce Huff. This was the biggest year of his career because if he did what he did this year, look, you see what happens. He's probably going to get a lot of money in free agency because you see it all the time. B+ players get played A+ money in free agency. So I get not re-signing Huff earlier. I hope Joe Douglas learned his lesson earlier. I would try to extend Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner earlier because those money values are just going up and up. But look, I get where they're coming from, but it's I always tend to give the benefit of the doubt a little bit because, again, if you looked at the whole picture, he was a situational pass rusher and someone that had only 7.5 sacks for the first 3 years. And the biggest thing with this is if they really love Bryce Huff and they really believed in, again, I know that a lot of people are going to take this the wrong way, but they really believed in Huff, they wouldn't have taken McDonald in the first round. I really believe that. Junior Aquino, first round, pick the best left tackle, even if you have to trade up a second round pick. Well, the problem is they don't have a second round pick. If we get a receiver, then the third pick a guard. Well, Jets only have a first and a third, Junior. So the problem with that scenario is, let's play devil's advocate. Let's say the Jets want to trade up. And I've seen a lot of the mock drafts. The Penn State kid following the Jets at 10. If they did that, I'm popping champagne on draft night. But the teams you have to wonder, the other thing we also have to think about with the draft, and we'll get into this a lot more because I love talking the trade scenarios, is it takes 2 to tango. The problem is I think you want to get ahead of the Bears because I do think the Bears would like to take potentially a tackle. The Falcons, I don't think are going to drop down to 10. Like, you have to wonder who's going to want to trade down with the Jets or who can the Jets trade up with. I think the Titans are going to take the best offensive lineman available. I don't think the Giants are going to allow the Jets to move up to 6, even though they have all those draft picks, because I don't think the optics are not going to look great for the Giants, allowing the Jets to get the player they wanted. So that's the problem with the Jets. I think at 10, if they miss out on the tackles, they could trade back. I think there's a couple of guys that you can move back a couple spots. Like if Brock Bowers is there, I think it's easy. Let me put it this way. I think it'll be a lot easier for the Jets to trade back from 10 than from trading up from 10 to go up, even with the third round pick. Another thing is most of the country don't even know who Huff is. Also, whenever this team has gone deep in the playoffs, we always had a good O-line. Absolutely. I mean, you look at the last great offensive line, it was Mangold. And look, I think Bart Scott, I do really admire him as an analyst. I know some people don't love him, but he was on the Jets post-game, I think, show, and he brought up a really good point, which I think is really interesting and I think makes a lot of sense. And when you look at the great offensive line the Jets had back then, it fits. Hey, two guys, and you have to draft two guys high. Back then, they drafted Dick Brickashaw and Nick Mangold high, and they signed two big free agents. Now, the Jets tried that with Laken Tomlinson, didn't work, but they also have two high-end picks, AVT and Joe Tittman. Now, if they go and get a third one, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world, but you get another one. And then I think you still have to – I still would love to sign two offensive linemen. This is a really good guard free agency class. I'd try to sign a guard. But, yeah, I do think the offensive line – that's why I also suggested trading Huff. If you get that second-round pick, there's a lot of good starting guards and centers in that range. And I will talk more about those as well. Joe is a sign Huff. He is a Huff man, and I completely understand why. How many new offensive linemen will we have? Well, here's the other thing. Are you including guys on the team that are playing different positions? The problem, I think, with the Jets, and I will do this more at the offensive line one, which I'll do next week, because I have an interesting one scenario that I think the Jets should explore, especially if they get a second-round pick. We will get more into that again. I can't give everything out in one video, but I will do that next week. I have an interesting solution to the Jets' offensive line. I think Tittman's going to be back. I think AVT's going to be back. The question is where he's going to play. I have a feeling the Jets are going to I think his best position is still guard. I just have this feeling the Jets are going to put him at right tackle for a few reasons. Number one, it's harder to find a tackle than a guard. And I think that their thought process is if we somehow find another tackle, we can always move him back in, which is probably easier than the kicking him out again. But AVT's back, but again, you don't know about the health. The real X factor is Laken Tomlinson. I don't think Laken Tomlinson's a good guard. The one thing he does bring is availability, which is important. And the question is, has it been the guys next to him that have been killing him? Because really, the Jets have not had a good left tackle next to him throughout the duration of his career. Now, if they get a good left tackle next year, will he all of a sudden be a more solid player? It's a possibility. Now, look, the problem is the Jets can cut him, but it's going to have a massive cap hit in terms of, yes, they'll save about $10 million, but they'll also incur like an $8 million penalty. And the question is going to be, can you find a good replacement guard in that ballpark of like 12 to 13 million a year in free agency? Maybe. But I think that it'll come down to if the Jets find that guy in free agency, then they'll cut Tomlinson. But it's one of those things where I think the Jets are going to keep adding to the offensive line. They're not going to subtract. The only subtraction I think is going to be Becton for obvious reasons. Easiest fixes: draft a guard and center, move AVT to right tackle and sign a tackle, draft a tackle at 25. Draft a tackle. Do you mean age 25 or at the 25th pick? Like trading down, I guess is what you're suggesting potentially, Joe. Just go to that. But if our guy's staying there at number 8, what do you think we can trade up for him? That's going to be a good, interesting point. To move up to 8, again, on the surface, it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you go by the trade value chart, roughly it's 1,400 points for the 8th pick, 1,300 for 10. So if the Jets wanted to throw in their 3rd round pick, That's roughly 230. Usually the first pick, you have to go a little over that value. So that should get you over. And I don't think the Falcons would take anything less. Now, again, the Jets had the 4th round pick, which is for 70 points, but that doesn't get them over the mark. I think it would be a thing where basically the Jets would probably want to get a pick back. So basically, if they do the 1 and 3, they're going to want a 6th or 7th round back. So they, still keep a number of picks. But the problem then with Atlanta is, are they really going to trade back 2 spots if there's a quarterback? Like if Jaden Daniels, let's play devil's advocate. If Jaden Daniels is there. Now, I've heard this rumor too that Atlanta would trade the 8th pick for Justin Fields. I don't believe that. I think they would be creative and just keep that 1st round pick. The hard part too is if they're sitting there at 8, do they take a quarterback? Like I could see them taking Jaden Daniels. I could see them taking Penix. I could see them doing a lot, and they're not going to trade out of that spot. Again, it's going to come down to how the board falls. But at this moment, I just don't see that happening. Then the 1st round, the best again left tackle, then throw around a guard in their O-line. Fasciano, I guess, to me would be the guy I would covet the most. One guy that's interesting, who I've seen mock to the Jets a couple times, and he's someone I do really like, is Fuaga, the tackle from Oregon State. He's a really good run blocker. Again, some scouts see him as a guard. I could see him as a tackle. The problem is, though, I think he'd be a right tackle. So then the question is, would you mind? I'm of the philosophy, get the best players you can. And if he's a great right tackle, you have AVT at right guard and you have Tippmann at center. That's a good left to right. Now, again, you want to have a good left tackle, but that's another possibility as well. One guy I would stay away from is Latham. I am not a big Latham fan. And I've talked about Alabama offensive linemen on the show before. I just have problems with Alabama offensive line. I would use all draft as O-line and free agency on wide receiver and a backup quarterback. Like all draft, I don't hate that. Like I would take. This is a good offensive line draft too, especially in round 2 and 3. There's a couple of really good interior offensive linemen that I like, especially at the guard center. Now the hard part is, of course, to find the tackles. But this is a pretty good year in terms of overall guards and interior linemen. Like this is probably one of the deeper offensive tackle positions that we have seen in a long time, which I think is very exciting as well. And look, I think there's going to be some guys that are going to fall into round. Look, I thought Tippmann was going to be a late 1st round pick, and he fell to the Jets in the 40s. I think you're going to see a guy of like that caliber, maybe not an A player, but a really good BB plus offensive lineman be there on day 2. And look, the Jets need to hit on a late round pick. Like the great teams, the great offensive line, they always find one on day 3. And the Jets haven't found them. I always kept saying, I think it was with Trey Smith with the Chiefs, and I kept screaming every time the Jets would come up, pick him. I thought he was a starting guard. Pick him, pick him, pick him. And now I look at him as a starting guard, and I'm like, I was right on that one. But look, again, that was one of those ones where I just really love that kid. Sometimes it's just, you just watch them and you just go, okay, these are someone. One guy too, I would also like to in round 2. And again, I know it's not the sexiest pick, especially because it's defense. I also, if the Jets could somehow get Chris Jenkins' son, again, I just would love having Chris Jenkins' son on this team. Great interior defensive line. And look, he's a monster in the interior. And look, one of the weaknesses of this team was the run stopping. They could not stop the run. They were weak in the middle. They needed a good interior tackle. And look, I get it's not the sexiest pick, but if you put that monster next to Quinnen Williams and you have those 2 beef eaters in the middle of the defense and you have Jermaine Johnson, McDonald off the edge, I do think that is exciting. James, right now the Jets, let me double check on that for you. I know that they have the 3rd. Again, the other thing too is I'm not sure if they how the compensation picks work, because I'm trying to remember if the Jets have any compensation picks from last year. for free agency. I'm trying to remember. That's the hard part. So right now the Jets have the 10th pick. They have 72 in the third round. They have 2 4s with 112 and 114. They do not have a 5th round pick. They have 1 6, and then they have 2 7th round picks. So the 2 4th round picks could be interesting because they're both almost back-to-back 112 and 114. I could see them trying to package like 4 and 6, get back into the third round if someone falls. But again, I still think the Jets are going to add draft picks, even before, like I talked about trading Bryce Huff for draft picks. But there's a couple guys on this team I could trade for draft picks. I really do think so as well. Like one guy I could see being interesting for trading purposes could be John Franklin Myers. If they keep Huff, I think you can get a pick for him. We know Zach Wilson's going to get dealt. I don't think the Jets are going to get more than a 5th round pick, although who knows? It's a quarterback. We've seen crazier things happen. But I would be stunned. Like, let me put it this way. If the Jets can get a day, even if they have to throw in picks to get it, but they could get a day 2 pick for Zach Wilson, like even if they have to throw in a 4th rounder to do it, like I would do cartwheels because that to me is incredible value at this point. But I do think you're going to get a pick for Wilson. How much? Probably 5th or 6th, if I'm honest. Are there other players that the Jets can maybe try to move for some draft capital? Maybe. But again, the other thing too is, do they use some of that draft capital? Like, don't forget last year they traded the 7th round to get Chuck Clark, which I still think is a good deal. And I think he'll be a starting safety for this team next year. So that's the other thing too. So I do think you have to keep an eye on those as well. But those are the picks that they had. Any other questions, guys, in here before we wrap up today? I know we're talking about the draft a lot, but right now the Jets, we just went through, they have one pick in the first round, a 3rd, 2 4s, no 5ths, a 6, and 2 7ths. But I do think that they're going to probably get another pick for Zach, probably a day 3 pick, which I know isn't sexy. Maybe you could get a pick for JFM. Trying to think if there's any other players. I mean, they're going to cut Uzama. Like, there's no other players really you're going to get picks for on this team at this point. But those are some of the guys I would look in as well. The other thing too is like if Huff does go as a free agent, they're going to get that, but that's next year's compensation pick if they do that as well. The other thing too is I'm trying to remember. Maybe you guys can jog my memory because I know a couple of the Jets assistants are interviewing the compensation picks for minority coaches. If I might be wrong. I think that's the following season. Am I correct? I'm 99% sure, but I'll have to look that up. But that's another way because I know I saw it today. Like a couple of the defensive back coaches are getting interviews. I think that is if they even get a coordinator job too. So if the Jets lose a coordinator, they could get a potential draft pick. I do think that comes around the next year, though. I'm 99% sure, but I could be wrong. So don't take it for face value. But just seeing if there's any more questions that we have in here. James is in here. I hope I know we were talking earlier too. Who was it? I think it was a Joe or was it James that maybe didn't fully answer a question. Just let me know. But I know we were talking about the offensive line a little bit. I do think the way the Jets are going to approach this is Carr Warren's their swing tackle. He takes the role of Turner next year. You have AVT at a set position. We don't know what the Jets view him as, but they have him at one position, and you have Joe Tippmann. The rest is up to it. I think that as of now, they are going to consider Laken Tomlinson a member of this team until further notice. But as of right now, those are definitely the guys that I could definitely see being a part of this offensive line. Again, it's not great when there's going to be that much change along this offensive line, but they definitely have to do that. And my thought process too is, look, Huff either needs to be on this team or traded. And if you can turn that into a 2nd round pick, and I think in this draft, you can turn that 2nd round pick into a quarterback or into an offensive lineman. And if either are a hit, to me, yes, they're not the outside quarterback, offensive line is the sexiest position. But if you hit on the offensive line, that's a position which has more value. That's going to do it for this episode of Rich Sports Talk. We will have more great Jets content throughout this offseason. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, share us on Twitter, X, Facebook, wherever you share your content. Love to get more Jet fans in here. Check out our community page so we will have polls throughout the offseason and, of course, show ideas. My next episode will be coming either later this week or next week, and it will be a good one. It is an interesting solution to the offensive line problem and why the answer could be Joe Tippmann. We will have all that next week and a lot more throughout this offseason about the New York Jets offseason here on Rich Sports Talk.